Ambassador Bolton, thanks so much for joining us. President Trump has 13 more days in office. I know you have reservations about invoking the 25th Amendment. I don't know your feelings on impeachment. But what about those who say that President Trump right now poses a clear and present danger to the United States?
Well, I don't think we should exaggerate it. I'm not saying he's not a danger. I do believe that there's grave risk there, but we've got 13 days left, and I think those who advocate either the invocation of the 25th Amendment, which has never been used, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which is what we're talking about here, has never been used before. For very good reason, because it's probably the worst written provision of the Constitution, or impeachment, either one have to make the argument that that would leave us better off than simply gritting our teeth and trying to make it through the next 7 business days, which is all we've got left until noon on the 20th of January. And I find it hard to believe that they can make that case.
Well, that's one argument, but let me ask you, 13 days in Trump world is, first of all, like 6 years. And second of all, we've seen the havoc that he can wreak. Attorney General Barr, who is not an outspoken critic of President Trump, he publicly accused President Trump of, quote, orchestrating a mob to pressure Congress and violating his oath. Let me just ask you, do you think President Trump has blood on his hands?
I think he does. Look, I agree with Bill Barr. I think he did incite this mob with the clear intention of having them disrupt the Electoral College certification and delay it to give him more time. I don't think there's any question about it. But let's just take the 25th Amendment for a second. It says that if the vice president can round up a majority of the cabinet, they can write saying that the president is unable to fulfill the powers and duties of his office. In response, this is the 25th Amendment itself. Section 4 says the president can then write a letter saying, I can too. And if the vice president and this majority of the cabinet write back again and say, well, we still disagree, Congress then has 21 days to decide the issue. So imagine this. In the last 13 days of the Trump administration, you could have 2 people both claiming to hold the powers of the presidency. Do you think Donald Trump will back down when he gets a letter from Mike Pence? Think again. So are we better off with 2 presidents competing with each other in the last 13 days? I think you risk making the situation, which is bad as it is, far worse.
Interesting. What do you think about the members of Congress who have been pushing these lies about the election? Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Kevin McCarthy. How much blood do you think they have on their hands?
Well, I think this has been a real abuse of the Constitution here by people who should know better, lawyers who should know better. There's no constitutional basis for these challenges. The framers expressly created the Electoral College to minimize Congress's role in presidential elections. That's why they created the separation of powers, to have executive, legislative, and judicial powers separately. They gave the states responsibility for the elections primarily. That's the principle of federalism. So to hear Republicans object to the certification violates the separation of powers and federalism, not only 2 fundamental precepts of the Constitution, but 2 fundamental precepts of conservatism.
So I take your point on all of that, but in addition to that, this lie, the big lie that there was election fraud, even though court after court, election board after election board has found no evidence of widespread fraud that would make any difference in the election, this lie incited this mob, this insurrection. And I'm wondering how much responsibility people like Hawley and Cruz and McCarthy, do you think they have?
Well, I think a lot of people in the party who were intimidated by Trump and who didn't speak up to say that the president is not speaking the truth, there is responsibility. And I think the responsibility going forward, I think Mitt Romney said this very well yesterday, as Republicans, we now have an obligation to tell people what the truth was. I think we can do that. I think people can be convinced of it. I think it's critical that we do so. But it's I lay the responsibility primarily at the door of Donald Trump.
Do you have concerns about an orderly transition of power on January 20th? Do you think the Secret Service is going to have to escort President Trump out of the building?
No, I think he'll go to Mar-a-Lago, and I think that's the real secret of the next 13 days. Put him on Air Force One and let him go play golf. You know, let me just come back to the 25th Amendment in Section 4. Mike Pence, you know, Mr. Conspiracy, as he's known in Washington, to make this work would have to get a majority of the cabinet to sign up in secret. Why? Because if Donald Trump finds out that his secretary of fill-in-the-blank has signed this letter, he's going to fire the person. And then the signature on the letter won't have any force or effect. This is simply not workable. Not only is it dubious constitutionally to create the risk of two competing presidencies, it's not going to work.
Let me just ask you, because I hear your objections on a logistical basis. And I hear the idea, and I understand what you're saying in terms of this might actually make things worse. What about the principle? What about if in a different world, if an easier process and less of a risk of there becoming two competing presidents, then just as a matter of, boy, I really wish that he was no longer president and there was some easy way to do this, like right now, would you support that just as an idea?
Well, I think it's possible, but let's also talk about what the purpose of Section 4 was. It contemplated a president who had had a stroke or a heart attack, who was unconscious, flat on his back at Walter Reed.
Like Woodrow Wilson.
Unable. Yeah. Right, exactly. Exactly. Unlike Section 3 of Article 25, where the president himself signs over power, as has happened several times when presidents undergo operations, Section 4 is not a license for a coup. It says that the letter has to say the president is unable to fulfill the powers and duties of his office. What you're complaining about, and there's a risk that it's right, is that he is able to fulfill the duties and powers of the office. So you've got to be very careful here about delegitimizing the Constitution any further than we've already seen. And that's why the calculation has to be, are you better off pursuing the 25th Amendment or impeachment? And I don't think that case can be made.
A source tells CNN that President Trump initially resisted deploying the National Guard to try to get control of this MAGA terrorist insurrection. Sources tell CNN that he was borderline enthusiastic about what was going on. Mick Mulvaney is saying that he's different now than he was 8 months ago. Do you agree, or does this sound like the Donald Trump you always knew?
This is another day at the office for Donald Trump, and anybody says to the contrary just wasn't paying attention to him. I do think, to come back, though, to the Department of Defense here, and I know the Capitol Police are taking the blunt of the blame for the catastrophic failure of security that occurred yesterday. I have got to believe this question is much more complicated. The Justice Department, Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Secret Service were all involved, or should have been, behind the scenes. And I think this is not a question just of blaming the two sergeants at arms in the House and the Senate. They may bear a heavy share of the responsibility, but a lot more went wrong here. And I think one thing Congress can and should do immediately is try and assess what happened, because that catastrophe could have been averted, I think.